Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we're going to go into a reading from the work Babylonians and Assyrians, Life and Customs, first published in 1899 by A.H. Sayers. Now, this is the first chapter of the book, which gives a very good introduction, namely titled Babylonia and its Inhabitants. That's a good way to get started if you want to learn about this period. It's been on the list for a while. I'm surprised I haven't done it yet, but here we are. Now, as always, if you like the content, the best way to support is just to like and subscribe and tell your friends. Now, with that being said, let's all get nice and relaxed, and we can begin with Chapter 1. Babylonia and its Inhabitants. Babylonia was the gathering place of nations. Berosus, the Chaldean historian, tells us that after the creation, it was peopled by a mixture of races, and we read in the book of Genesis that Babel, or Babylon, was the first home of the manifold languages of mankind. This country, for the most part, had been won from the sea. It was the gift of the two great rivers, the Euphrates and Tigris, which once flowed separately into the Persian Gulf. Its first settlers must have established themselves on the desert plateau which fringes the Babylonian plain, rather than in the plain itself. The plain is formed of the silt deposited each year by the rivers that flow through it. It is in fact as much a delta as northern Egypt, correspondingly fertile too. Materials exist for determining approximately the rate in which this delta has been formed. The waters of the Persian Gulf are continually receding from the shore, and Ainsworth calculates that about 90 feet of land are added annually to the coastline. But the rate of deposit seems to have been somewhat more rapid in the past. At all events, Mohammerah, which in 1835 was 47 miles distant from the Gulf, stands on the site of Spasinus Charax, which, in the time of Alexander the Great, was not quite a mile from the sea. In 2,160 years, therefore, no less than 46 miles of land have been formed at the head of the Persian Gulf, or nearly 115 feet each year. The deposit of soil, however, may not have been so rapid in the flourishing days of Babylonian history, when the canals were carefully attended to, and the irrigation of the country kept under control. It is safer, therefore, to assume for the period preceding the rise of the Macedonian Empire at a rate of deposit of not more than 100 feet for each year. The seaport of primitive Chaldea was Eridu, not far from Ur, and as the mounds of Abu Shahrain and Nowawis, which now mark its site, are nearly 130 miles from the present line of coast, we must go back as far as 6,500 BC for the foundation of the town. Ur of the Chaldees, as it is called in the book of Genesis, was some 30 miles to the north, and on the same side of the Euphrates. The ruins of its great temple of the moon god are now known by the name Mukayyar or Muger. It must have been founded on the sandy plateau of the Arabian desert at a time when the plain enclosed between the Tigris and the Euphrates was still too marshy for human habitation. As the moon god of Ur was held to be the son of Enlil of Nippur, Dr. Peters is doubtless right in believing that Ur was a colony of that latter city. Nippur is the modern Nefer or Nefar in the north of Babylonia, and recent excavations have shown that its temple was the chief sanctuary and religious center of the civilized Eastern world in the earliest epoch to which our records reach. Eridu, Ur, and Nippur seem to have been the three chief cities of primeval Babylonia. As we shall see in a future chapter, Eridu and Nippur were the centers from which the early culture and religion of the country were diffused. But there was an essential difference between them. The god of Eridu, was a god of light and beneficence, who employed his divine wisdom in healing the sick and restoring the dead to life. He had given man all the elements of civilization. Rising each morning out of his palace under the waters of the deep, he taught them the arts, sciences, the industries, and the manners of civilized life. El-Lil of Nippur, on the contrary, was the lord of the underworld. Magical spells and incantations were his gifts to mankind, and his kingdom was over the dead rather than of the living. The culture which emanated from Eridu and Nippur was thus of a wholly different kind. Is it possible that the settlers in these two cities were of a different race? Of this, there is no proof. Such evidence as we have tells against it, and the contrast in the character of cultures of Eridu and Nippur can be explained in another way. Eridu was a seaport, its population in contact with other races, and its ships traded with the coasts of Arabia. The myth which told how or Oannes had brought the elements of civilization to his people stated that he came from the waters of the Persian Gulf. The culture of Eridu thus may have been due to foreign intercourse. Eridu was a city of merchants and sailors, Nippur of sorcerer priests. Eridu and Nippur, however, alike owed their origin to a race which we will term Sumerian. Its members spoke different dialects, and the primitive civilization of Babylonia was their creation. They were the founders of great cities and temples, the inventors of the pictorial system of writing out of which the cuneiform characters subsequently developed, the instructors in culture of their Semitic neighbors. How deep and far-reaching was their influence may be gathered from the fact that the earliest civilization of Western Asia finds its expression in the Sumerian language and script. To whatever race the writer might belong, he clothed his thoughts in the words and characters of the Sumerian people. The fact makes it more difficult for us to determine whether the princes of primitive Chaldea, whose inscriptions have come down to us, were Semites or not. Their very names assume Sumerian forms. It was from the Sumerian that Semite learned to live in cities. His own word for city was Alu, the Hebrew Oel, a tent, which is still used in the Old Testament in the sense of home. The Hebrew Ir is the Sumerian Eri. Ekalu, the Hebrew Hekal, a palace, comes from the Sumerian Egal, or great house. The first palaces seen by the Semitic nomad must have been those of Chaldean towns. But a time came when the Semite had absorbed the culture of his Sumerian teachers and had established kingdoms of his own in the future Babylonia. For untold centuries, he lived in the intermixture with the older population of the country, and the two races acted and reacted on each other. A mixed people was the result, with a mixed language and a mixed form of religion. The Babylonia of latter days was, in fact, a country whose inhabitants and language were as composite as the inhabitants and language of modern England. Members of the same family had names derived from different families of speech, and while the old Sumerian borrowed Semitic words which it spelt phonetically, the Semitic lexicon was enriched with loan words from Sumerian, which were treated like Semitic roots. The Semitic improved upon the heritage he had received. Even the system of writing was enlarged and modified. Its completion and arrangement are due to Semitic scribes who had been trained in Sumerian literature. It was probably at the court of Sargon of Akkad that we may have the term of final revision of the syllabary taking place. At all events, even after his epic, the cuneiform script underwent but little real change. Sargon was the founder of the first Semitic empire in Asia. His date was placed by the native historians as far back as 3800 BC, and as they had an abundance of materials at their disposal for setting it, which we do not possess, we have no reason to dispute it. Moreover, it harmonizes with the length of time required for bringing about the fusion of Sumerian and Semitic elements which created the Babylonia that we know. The power of Sargon extends to the Mediterranean, even, it may be, to the island of Cyprus. His conquests were continued by his son and successor Naram-Sin, who made his way to the precious copper mines of the Sinaitic Peninsula, the chief source of the copper that was used so largely in the work of his day. The land of the Amorites, as Syria was called, was already a Babylonian province, and he could therefore march in safety toward the south through the desert region, which was known as Meluka. How long did the empire of Sargon last? We do not know, but it spread Babylonian culture to the distant west and brought it to the very border of Egypt. It was, too, a culture which had become essentially Semitic. The Sumerian elements on which it was based had been thoroughly transformed. What Babylonian civilization was in the last days of Chaldean history, that it already was, to all intents and purposes, in the age of Sargon. The Sumerian and the Semitic had become one people. But the mixture of nationalities in Babylonia was not yet complete. Colonies of Amorites from Canaan settled in it for the purposes of trade. Wandering tribes of Semites from northern Arabia pastured their cattle on the banks of its rivers, and in the Abrahamic age a line of kings from southern Arabia made themselves masters of the country and established their capital at Babylon. Their names resembled those of southern Arabia on the one hand, or the Hebrews on the other, and the Babylonian scribes were forced to give translations of them in their own language. But all these incomers belonged to the Semitic race, and the languages they spoke were but varieties of the same family of speech. It is probable that such was the case with the Chaldar, who lived in the marshes at the mouth of the Euphrates, and from whom classical geography has derived the name of Chaldean. The extension of the name to the whole population of Babylonia was due to the reign of the Chaldea prince Merodach Baladan at Babylon. For years, he represented Babylonian freedom in its struggle with Assyria. In his Chaldean subjects, became an integral part of the population. Perhaps, too, the theory is right, which makes Nebuchadnezzar of Chaldea descent. If so, there was a good reason why the inhabitants of Babylonia should have become Chaldeans in the classical age. Of wholly different origin were the Kassites, mountaineers from the east of Elam, who conquered Babylonia and founded a dynasty of kings which lasted for several centuries. They also gave their name to the population of the country, and in Tel el Amarna tablets, accordingly, the natives of Babylonia are known as Kassi. Sennacherib founded their kinsfolk in the Elamite mountains, and here they still lived in the age of the Greek writers. Strabo calls them Kosians, and it seems probable that they are the same as the Kissians, after whom the whole of Elam was named for. At any rate, the Kassites were neither Sumerians nor Semites, and their language, of which several words have been preserved, has no known connections. But they left their mark upon the Babylonian people, and several family names were borrowed from them. The Babylonian was thus a compound of Sumerian, Semitic, and Kassite elements. They all went to form the culture on which we term Babylonian, and which left all such enduring traces on Western Asia and the world. Mixed races are invariably the best, and the Babylonians were no exception to the rule. We have only to compare them to our neighbors, the more purely blooded Semitic Assyrians, to assure ourselves of the fact. The culture of Assyria was but an imitation and reflection of that of Babylonia. There was nothing original about it. The Assyrian excelled only in the ferocities of war, not in the arts of peace. Even the gods of Assyria had migrated from the southern kingdom. The dual character of Babylonian civilization must never be forgotten. It serves to explain a good deal that would otherwise be puzzling in the religious and social life of the people. But the social life was also influenced and conditioned by the particular nature of the country in which the people lived. It was an alluvial plain, sloping towards the sea, and inundated by the overflow of two great rivers which ran through it. When cultivated, it was exceedingly fertile, but cultivation implied a careful regulation of the overflow, as well as a constant attention to the embankments which kept out the waters, or to the canals which drained and watered the soil. The inhabitants were, therefore, necessarily agriculturalists. There were also irrigators and engineers, compelled to study how best to regulate the supply of water, to turn the pestiferous marsh into a fruitful field, and to confine the rivers and canals within their channels. Agriculture and engineering thus had their natural home in Babylonia, and originated in the character of the country itself. The neighborhood of the sea and of the two great waterways which flanked the Babylonian plain further gave up an impetus to trade. The one opened the road to the spice-bearing coast of southern Arabia and the more distant shores of Egypt. The other led to the highlands of western Asia. From the first, the Babylonians were merchants and sailors, as well as agriculturalists. The cry of the Chaldeans was in their ships. The seaport of Eridu was one of the earliest of Babylonian cities, and a special form of boat took its name from the more inland town of Ur. While the population of that country devoted itself to agriculture, the towns grew wealthy by the help of trade. Their architecture was dependent on the nature of the country. In the alluvial plain, no stone was procurable. Clay, on the other hand, was everywhere. All buildings accordingly were constructed out of clay bricks, baked in the sun and bonded together with cement, and of the same material. Their roofs were of wood, supported not unfrequently by the stems of the palm. The palm stems in time became pillars, and Babylonia was thus the birthplace of columnar architecture. It was also the birthplace of decorated walls. It was needful to cover the sun-dried bricks with plaster for the sake of both their preservation and of their appearance. This was the origin of the stucco with which the walls were overlaid, and which came in time to be ornamented with painting. Ezekiel refers to these figures, portrayed in vermilion, which adorned the walls of the houses of the rich. The want of stone and the abundance of clay had another unique influence on Babylonian culture. It led to the invention of the written clay tablet, which has had such momentous results for the civilization of the whole Eastern world. The pictures with which Babylonia began writing with were soon discarded for conventional forms, which could be easily impressed by the stylus upon the soft clay. It is probable that the use of clay as a writing material was first suggested by the need there was in matters of business that the contracting party should record their names. The absence of stone made every pebble valuable, and pebbles were accordingly cut into cylindrical forms and engraved with signs. When the cylinder was rolled over a lump of wet clay, its impress remained forever. The signs became cuneiform characters, and the Babylonian wrote them upon clay instead of stone. The seal cylinder and the use of clay as a writing material must consequently be traced to the peculiar character of the country in which the Babylonian lived. To the same origin, it must be ascribed his mode of burial. The tomb was built of bricks. There were no rocky cliffs in which to excavate it, and the marshy soil made a grave unsanitary. It was doubtless sanitary reasons alone caused the wood to be heaped about the tomb after an interment and set on fire, so that all within was partially consumed. The narrow limits of the Babylonian plain obliged the cemetery of the dead to adjoin the houses of the living, and cremation, whether partial or complete, became a necessity. Even the cosmogony of the Babylonians has been influenced by their surroundings. The world, it was believed, originated in a watery chaos, like that in which the first settlers had found the Babylonian plain. The earth not only rested on the waters, but the waters themselves, dark and unregulated, were the beginning of all things. This cosmological conception was carried with the rest of Babylonian culture to the west, and after passing through Canaan, found its way into Greek philosophy. In the book of Genesis we read that darkness was on the face of the deep, before the creative spirit of God brooded over it, and Thales, the first of the Greek philosophers, taught that water was the principle out of which all things have come. The fertility of the Babylonian soil was remarkable. Grain, it was said, gave a return of 200 for 1, sometimes of 300 for one. Herodotus, or the authority he quotes, grows enthusiastic upon this subject. The leaf of the wheat and the barley, he says, is as much as 3 inches in width, and the stalks of the millet and sesamum are so tall that no one who has never been in that country would believe me if I were to mention their height. In fact, naturalists tell us that Babylonia was the primitive home of the cultivated cereals, wheat and probably barley, and that from the banks of the Euphrates they must have been disseminated throughout the civilized world. Wheat, indeed, has been found growing wild in our own days in the neighborhood of Hit. The dissemination of wheat goes back to a remote epoch. Like barley, it is met with in tombs of that prehistoric population of Egypt, which still lived in the Neolithic age and whose latter remains are coeval with the first pharaonic epoch. The fact throws light on the antiquity of the intercourse which existed between the Euphrates and the Nile, and bears testimony to the influence already exerted on the Western world by the culture of Babylonia. We have, indeed, no written records which go back to so distant a past. It belongs, perhaps, to an epoch when the art of writing had not as yet been invented. But there was already civilization in Babylonia, and the elements of its future social life were already in existence. Babylonian culture is immeasurably old. Okay, now with introductions out of the way, we're going to move on to the second chapter, dealing with the family. Because why not? 2 principles struggled for recognition in Babylonian family life. One was the patriarchal, the other the matriarchal. Perhaps they were due to a duality of race. Perhaps they were merely a result of the circumstances under which the Babylonian lived. At times it would seem as if we must pronounce the Babylonian family to have been patriarchal in its character. At other times, the wife and mother occupies an independent and even commanding position. It may be noted that whereas the old Sumerian hymns, the woman takes precedence of the man, the Semitic translation invariably reverses the order. The one has female and male, the other male and female. Elsewhere in the Semitic world, where the conceptions of Babylonian culture had not penetrated, the woman was subordinate to the man, his helpmate, not his equal. In this respect, nothing can be more significant than the changes undergone by the name and worship of the goddess Ishtar, when they were carried from Babylonia to the Semites of the West. In Babylonia, she was a goddess of independent power, who stood on a footing of equality with the gods. But in southern Arabia and Moab, she became a male divinity, and in the latter country was even identified with the supreme god, Chemosh. In Canaan, she passed into the feminine Ashtoreth, and at last was merged in the crowd of goddesses, who were but feminine reflections of a male. A goddess whose attributes did not differ from those of a god was foreign to the religious ideas of the purely Semitic mind. It was otherwise in Babylonia. There the goddess was the equal of the god, while on earth the women claimed rights which placed them almost on an equal level with the men. One of the early sovereigns of the country was a queen, Elat Gula, and even in Assyria the bas-reliefs of Ashurbanipal represent the queen as sitting and feasting by the side of her husband. a list of trees brought to Akkad in the reign of Sargon, 3800 BC, speaks of them as having been conveyed by the servants of the queen. And if Dr. Scheele is right in his translation of the Sumerian words, the kings of Ur before the days of Abraham made their daughters high priestesses of foreign lands. Up to the last Babylonian woman, in her own name, could enter into partnership with others, could buy and sell, lend and borrow, could appear as a plaintiff and a witness in the court of law, could even bequeath her property as she wished. In a deed dated in the second year of Nabonidus, 555 BC, a father transfers all his property to his daughter, reserving to himself only the use of it during the rest of his life. In return, the daughter agrees to provide him with the necessities of later life, food and drink, oil and clothing. A few years later, in the second year of Cyrus, a woman by the name of Nubta, or B, hired out a slave for 5 years in order that he might be taught the art of weaving. She stipulated to give him 1 car, or about a quart and a half of food each day, and to provide him with clothing while he was learning the trade. It is evident that Nubta owned looms and traded in woven fabrics, all on her own account. Nubta was the daughter of Ben-Hadad Amara, a Syrian settled in Babylonia, who had been adopted by another Syrian of the name Ben-Hadad Nathan. After the latter's death, his widow brought an action before the royal judges to recover her husband's property. She stated that after their marriage, she and Ben-Hadad Nathan had traded together, and that a house had been purchased with a portion of her dowry. This house, the value of which was as much as 110 manes, 50 shekels, had been assigned in her perpetuity. The half-brother, Jacob El, or Akabi Il, however, now claimed everything, and that includes the house. The case was tried at Babylon before 6 judges in the 9th year of Nabonidus, and they decided in favor of the plaintiff. One of the documents that have come down to us from the age of Abraham records the gift of a female slave by a husband to his wife. The slave and her children, it was laid down, were to remain the property of the wife in case of either divorce or of the husband's death. The right of the women to hold private property of her own, over which the male heirs had no control, was thus early recognized by the law. In latter times, it is referred to in numberless contracts. In the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, for instance, in the 11th century BC, we find a field bequeathed first to a daughter and then to a sister. In the beginning of the reign of Nabonidus, we hear of a brother and sister, the children of a naturalized Egyptian, inheriting their family's property together. And in the 4th year of Cyrus and his son Cambyses sued for the payment of a loan which he had made to the Babylonian on the security of some house property, and which was accordingly refunded by the debtor's wife. Other deeds relate to the borrowing of money by a husband and his wife in partnership, to a wife selling a slave for a manet of silver on her own account, to a woman bringing an action before 6 judges at the beginning of the reign of Nabonidus to recover the price of a slave she had sold, and to another woman who 2 years previously was the witness to the sale of a house. Further proofs are not needed of the independent position of the woman, whether married or single, and of her equality with the man in the eyes of the law. It would seem that she was on a level with him, also in the eyes of religion. There were priestesses in Babylon as well as priests. The oracles of Ishtar at Arbela were worked by inspired prophetesses, who thus resembled Deborah and Huldah and the other prophetesses of Israel. When Esarhaddon inquired of the will of heaven, it was from the prophetesses of Ishtar that he received encouragement and a promise of victory. From the earliest period, moreover, there were women who lived like nuns, unmarried and devoted to the service of the sun god. The office was held in high honor. One of the daughters of King Amnizadok, the fourth successor of Hammurabi, or Amraphel, being a devotee of the god. In the reign of the same king we find two of these devotees and their nieces letting for a year 9 fedans or acres of ground in the district in which the Amorites of Canaan were settled. This was done by command of the high priest Sar-Elu, a name in which suggests that we should see that of Israel. The women were to receive a shekel of silver, or 3 shillings, the produce of the field, by way of rent, while 6 measures of corn on every 10 fedans were to be set apart for the sun god himself. In the previous reign, a house had been let at an annual rent of 2 shekels, which was the joint property of a devotee of the sun god Samas and her brother. It is clear that the consecration of the service of the deity did not prevent the nun from owning and enjoying property. Like Samas, the sun god Ishtar was also served by a woman, who, however, do not seem to have led the same reputable lives. They were divided into 2 classes, one of which was called the wailers, from the lamentations with which each year they mourned the death of the god Tammuz, the stricken favorite of Ishtar. The Chaldean epic of Gilgamesh speaks of the troops of them, and that they were gathered together in the city of Erech. Here Ishtar had her temple along with her father, Anu, the sky god, and here accordingly her devotees were assembled. Like the goddess, they served. It would appear that they were never married in lawful wedlock, but they nevertheless formed a corporation, like the corporations of the priests. Babylonian law and custom also prevailed in Assyria, so far as can be gathered from the contracts that have come down to us. The Assyrian women enjoyed almost as many privileges as their sisters in Babylonia. Thus, in 668 BC, we find a lady, Sarpi by name, buying the sister of a man whose slave she was, for reasons unknown to us, and paying half a manet of silver for the girl. Sarpi was a prefectess, like another lady who was called the prefectess of Nineveh, and who in 683 BC purchased 17 slaves and a garden. It is plain from this that women could hold civil offices, and even act as governors of a city. In fact, wherever Babylonian culture and law extended, the principles and practice of it were necessarily in force. The Amorite colonies from Canaan established in Babylonia for the purposes of trade in the age of Abraham were naturally subject to the Babylonian laws, and the women among them possessed all the rights of their Babylonian neighbors. At the very beginning of the dynasty to which Hammurabi belonged, an Amorite lady, a certain Kuriatum, brought an action for the recovery of a field which had been the property of her father. Kuriatum and her brother were themselves subsequently sued by 3 other Amorites, the children of Eziidre. one of whom was a woman, for a field and a horse, together with some slaves and palm trees of which it was asserted they had wrongfully taken possession. The judges, however, after hearing both sides, dismissed the case. It is not strange that the same laws and principles should have held good in Canaan itself, which was so long a Babylonian province. Sarah, who was of Babylonian origin, owned a female slave, Genesis 2, 6, 8, and 9, and the Kenizzite Caleb assigned a field with springs to his daughter Achsah in the early days of the invasion of Canaan, Joshua 15, 18-19. A Canaanitish lady takes part in the Tel El Amarna correspondence and writes to the Pharaoh on matters of state, while the Mosaic law allowed the daughter to inherit the possessions of her father. This, however, was the only case where there was no son after the Israelite conquest of Canaan, when the traditions of Babylonian custom had passed away. We hear no more of brothers and sisters sharing together the inheritance of their father, or of a wife bequeathing anything which belongs to her of right. As regards the women, the law of Israel, after the settlement in Canaan, was the moral law of the Semitic tribes. We must go back to the age of Abraham and Sarah to find a Hebrew woman possessed of the same powers as the Babylonian lady. In the 5th year of Cambyses, sold a slave for 2 manes and 5 shekels of silver, her husband and mother guaranteeing the value of the chattel that was thus sold. The dowry which the women brought with her on her marriage secured of itself her independence. It was her absolute property, and she could leave it by will as she pleased. It protected her from the tyrannical conduct on part of her husband, as well as from the fear of divorce on insufficient grounds. If a divorce took place, the dowry had to be restored to her in full, and she then returned to her father's house or set up an establishment of her own. When no dowry had been brought by the bride, the husband was often required by the marriage contract to pay her a specified sum of money in case of a divorce. Thus, the marriage contract made in Babylon in the 13th year of Nebuchadnezzar stipulates that if the husband marries a second wife, the act shall be equivalent to a divorce of the first, who shall accordingly receive not only her dowry, but a manet of silver as well. The payment, in fact, was a penalty on the unfaithfulness of the husband, and served as a check upon both divorce and polygamy. The dowry consisted not of money alone, but also of slaves and furniture, the value of which was stated in the marriage contract. In the contract just referred to, for instance, part of the dowry consisted of a slave who was valued at half a manet. Sometimes the dowry included cattle and sheep. In the 6th year of Nabonidus, we hear of 3 slaves, and furniture with which to stock the house, besides a manet of silver, being given as the marriage portion. In this instance, however, the silver was not forthcoming on the wedding day, and in the place of it a slave valued at 2/3 a manet was accepted, the remaining third being left for payment at a subsequent date. Where the dowry could not be paid at once, security for the payment of it was taken by the bridegroom. The payment was made not by the bridegroom, as among the Israelites and other Semitic peoples, but by the father of the bride, if he were dead, or if the mother of the bride had been divorced and was in the enjoyment of her own property. The mother took the place of her father, and was expected to provide the dowry. In such a case, she also naturally gave permission for the marriage, and it was from her, accordingly, that consent to it had to be obtained. In one instance, however, in a deed dated in the 16th year of Nabonidos, a sister is given in marriage by her 2 brothers, who consequently furnish the dowry, consisting of a piece of gold inherited from the mother, a slave, clothes, and furniture. It is evident that in this case, both parents must have been dead. It was the bridegroom's duty and interest to see that the dowry was duly paid. He enjoyed the usufruct of it during his life, and not unfrequently it was employed not only to furnish the house of the newly married couple, but also to start them in business. It was with his wife's dowry that Ben-Hadad Nathan bought in part the house to which his widow laid claim after his death, and we read of instances in which the husband and wife enter into partnership in order to trade with the wife's money. More frequently, the wife uses her dowry to transact business separately, her purchases and loans being made in her own name. This is especially the case if she otherwise has property of her own. At times, the son-in-law found it difficult to get the dowry paid. From a deed dated in the 3rd year of Cambyses, we gather that the dowry, instead of being delivered into the hand of the bridegroom, as ought to have been done at the time of marriage, was still unpaid 9 years later. Sometimes, of course, this was due to the inability of the father-in-law to discharge his debt through bankruptcy, death, or some other cause, where, therefore, the money was not immediately forthcoming. Security was taken for its future payment. If payment in full was impossible, owing to pecuniary losses incurred after the marriage contract had been drawn up, the bridegroom was entitled to claim a proportionate amount of it on behalf of his wife. The heirs were called upon to pay what was due if the father-in-law died between the drawing up of the contract and the actual marriage. And when the wife died without children, it returned to her father's house. If the husband died and his widow married again, she carried her former dowry with her. In such a case, the children of the first marriage inherited 2/3 of it upon her death, the remaining third going to the children of the second husband. This was in accordance with a law which regulated the succession to the property of a father who had married a second time, the children of the first marriage receiving 2/3 of it, and the remainder being reserved for the children of the second wife. The law could only be overruled by a will made during the man's lifetime, and properly attested by witnesses. The dowry could not be alienated by the wife without the consent of her parents, if they were still alive. In the year of Nergal-Sharezar's accession, for example, a certain Nergal-Balidi and his wife Dibta wished to sell a slave who had not constituted the dowry of Dibta for 25 shekels. But the sale was not considered valid until the consent of both her father and mother had been obtained. The dowry was not the only property the woman was able to hold. She had similar power to hold and dispose of whatever else had come by her inheritance or gift. The gains she had in business, the proceeds of the sale of her estates, and the interest upon the capital she lent, all belonged to herself, and to herself alone. The purposes of succession, they were reckoned along with the dowry constituting her property during life. In the 34th year of Nebuchadnezzar, for instance, the father stipulates that the creditors of his daughter's father-in-law should have no claim, either upon her dowry or upon any other part of her possessions. The power of the married woman over her property was doubtless the result of the system which provided her with a dowry. The principle of her absolute control over the latter once admitted, it was extended by the law to the rest of her estate. She thus took rank by the side of the man, and like him, could trade or otherwise deal with her property as she chose. The dowry, in fact, must have been her original charter of freedom, but it was so because it was given by her father and not by the bridegroom. Where it was the gift of the bridegroom, it was not but a civilized form of purchasing the bride. In such a case, the husband had a right to the person and possession of the wife, inasmuch as he had bought her. As much right, in fact, as he had to the person and possession of a slave. The wife was merely a superior slave. Where, however, the dowry was the gift of the bride's father, the conditions were reversed. The husband received not only a wife, but he also received an estate along with her. Here it was upon whom the benefit was conferred, and he had to accept the conditions offered him, not to make them. In a commercial state like Babylonia, property represented personality, and the personality of the wife accordingly remained with the family from which her property was derived, rather than with the husband, to whom the use of it was lent. Hence the independence of the married woman in Babylonia and her complete freedom of action as regards her husband. The property she possessed, the personality it represented, belonged to herself alone. Traces, however, may be detected of an older order of things which once existed, at all events in the Semitic element of the Babylonian population. The dowry had to be paid to the husband to be deposited, as it were, in his hand. It was with him that the marriage contract was made, thus must surely go back to an age when the marriage portion was really given to the bridegroom, and he had the same right over it as was enjoyed until recently by the husband in England. Moreover, the right of divorce retained by the husband, like the fact that the bride was given away by a male relation, points in the same direction. According to an early Sumerian law, while the repudiation of the wife on the part of the husband was punishable only with a small fine, for the repudiation of the husband by a wife, the penalty was death. A deed drawn up in the time of Hammurabi shows that this law was still in force in the age of Abraham. It lays down that if the wife is unfaithful to her husband, she may be drowned, while the husband can rid himself of his wife by the payment of only a manet of silver. Indeed, as late as the time of Nebuchadnezzar, the old law remained unrepealed, and we find a certain Nebo-Aki-Idin who married a singing woman, stipulating in the marriage contract that if he should divorce her and marry another, he was to pay her 6 manes. But if, on the other hand, she committed adultery, she should be put to death with an iron sword. In this instance, however, the husband married beneath him, and in view of the antecedents of the wife, the penalty with which she was threatened in case of unfaithfulness was perhaps necessary. She came to him, moreover, without either a dowry or family relations who could give her away. She was thus little better than the concubines whom the Babylonian was allowed to keep by the side of his lawful wife. But even so, the marriage contract had to be made out in full legal form, and the penalty to be paid for her divorce was as much as £54. With this, she could have lived comfortably, and probably have no difficulty in finding another husband. Just a quick note, the £54 he mentioned is £54 in 1899 time, not in our normal times. Back to the text. The concubine was usually a slave who had been bought by the bridegroom. Occasionally, by agreement with the parents, the wife herself was in much of the same position. Thus, Dagil Ili, who married the daughter of a lady named Kama, gave the mother 1.5 manes of silver, and a slave worth half a mane, and agreed that if he married another wife, he would give her daughter a mane and send her back to her old home. Here, the husband practically buys his wife, though even so the law obliged him to divorce her if he married again, and also gave him a fine for doing so. Kama was apparently in financial difficulties, and consequently, instead of furnishing her daughter with a dowry, received money from the bridegroom. It was a private agreement, and utterly opposed the usual custom. The parents had, however, the power of selling their children before they came of age, and when the parents were dead, the same power was possessed, at any rate in Assyria, by a brother in case of a sister. Doubtless, the power was restricted by law, but the instances in which we hear of it being exercised are so rare that we do not know what these restrictions were, nor do we know the reasons which they were considered sufficient to justify divorce. The language of the early laws would seem to imply that originally it was quite enough to pronounce the words, "Thou art not my wife, thou art not my husband." But the loss of the wife's dowry and the penalties attached to divorce must have tended to check it on the part of the husband, except in exceptional circumstances. Perhaps want of children was held to be a sufficient pretext for it. Certainly adultery must have been so. Another case of divorce was a legal one. A second marriage invalidated the first if the first wife was still alive. This is very astonishing in a country where polygamy was allowed. It proves that polygamy was greatly restricted in practice, and that the tendency of laws was to forbid it altogether. Among the multitudes of contracts of the Second Babylonian Empire, it is difficult to find any which to show that a man had 2 legitimate wives living at one and the same time. The high position of the mother in the family, her independence and commercial equality with her husband were all against it. It is only where the wife is bought a slave that polygamy can actually flourish. In early times, it is true, the rich Babylonian indulged in the possession of more than one wife. Some contracts of the age of Hammurabi, translated by Mr. Pinchers, are particularly instructive in this respect. We hear in them a certain Arad Samas, who first married a lady called Taram Sagila and then adopted her sister Iltani. Iltani is ordained, shall be under the orders of her sister, shall prepare her food, carry her chair to the temple of Merodach, and obey her in all things. Not a word is said about the divorce of the first wife. It is taken for granted that she is to remain at the head of the household, the younger and second wife acting as her servant. The position of Iltani, in fact, is not very different from that of a slave, and it is significant, rather, that neither wife brought a dowry with her. As we have seen in the case of Dagil Ili, the law and custom of later Babylonia displayed a complete change of feeling or practice. Marriage with a second wife came to involve, as a matter of course, divorce from the first. Even when there had been an agreement and the first wife had been without a dowry, The woman had thus gained a second victory. The rule that bound her in regard to marriage was now applied to the man. The privilege of marrying two husbands at once had been denied her. Usage was now denying a similar privilege to him. It was only when the first wife was dead or divorced that a second could be taken. The wife might have a successor, but not a rival. The divorced wife was regarded by law as a widow, and could therefore marry again. A deed of divorce, dated in the reign of the father of Hammurabi, expressly grants her this right. To the remarriage of the widow there was naturally no bar, but the children by the two marriages belonged to different families and were kept carefully distinct. This is illustrated by a curious deed drawn up at Babylon in the 9th year of Nabonidus. A certain Bel-Katsir, who had been adopted by his uncle, married a widow who already had a son. She bore him no children, however, and he accordingly asked the permission of his uncle to adopt his stepson, making him the heir of his uncle's property. To this the uncle objected, and it was finally agreed that if Bel-Katsir had no child, he was to adopt his own brother, and so secure the succession of the estate to a member of his own family. The property of the mother probably went to her son, but she had the power to leave it as she liked. This may be gathered from a will dated in the 7th year of Cyrus, in which a son leaves property to his father in case of death, which had come from him, his maternal grandfather and grandmother. The property had been specially bequeathed to him, doubtless after his mother's death, the grandmother passing over the rest of her descendants in his favor. The marriage ceremony was partly religious, partly civil. No marriage was legally valid without the contract duly attested and signed. The Babylonians carried their business habits into all departments of life, and in the eyes of the law, matrimony was a legal contract, the forms of which had to be duly observed. In the latter days of the Babylonian history, the legal and civil aspect of the rite seems to have been exclusively considered, but at an earlier period it required also the sanction of religion, and Mr. Pinches has published a fragmentary Sumerian text in which the religious ceremony is described. Those who have officiated at it first place their hands and feet against the hands and feet of the bridegroom, and the bridegroom laid her neck by the side of his, and was made to say, "Silver and gold shall fill thy lap, thou art my wife, I am thy husband, like the fruit of an orchard, I will give thee offspring." Next came the ceremony of binding the sandals on the feet of the newly wedded pair, and of handing them the latchet wherewith the shoes should be tied, as well as a purse of silver and gold. The purse perhaps symbolized the dowry, which was given by the father of the bride. In the time of Nebuchadnezzar, the ceremony was restricted to joining together the hands of the bride and bridegroom. According to Herodotus, a gigantic system of public prostitution prevailed in Babylonia. Every unmarried woman was compelled to remain in the sacred enclosure of Milita, by which Ishtar is apparently meant, until some stranger had submitted to her embraces, while the sums derived from the sale of their personal charms by the handsome and good-looking provided portions for the ugly. Of all this, there is not a trace in the mass of native documents which we now possess. There were the devotees of Ishtar, certainly, the Uaktu and the Karimatu, as well as public workers who were under the protection of the law, but they formed a class apart and had nothing to do with the respectable women of the country. On the contrary, in the age of Hammurabi, it was customary to state in the marriage contracts that no stain whatever rested upon the bride. Thus we read in one of them, Ana-a-Uzni, the daughter of Salimat. Salimat has given her a dowry and has offered her in marriage to Bel-Sunu, the son of the artisan. Ana-a-Uzni is pure. No one has anything against her. The dowry, as we have seen, was paid by near relations of the wife, and where there was none, as in the case of the singing woman married by Nebu-Aki-Iddin, there was no dowry at all. The dowries provided for the ugly by the prostitution of the rich must have been an invention of the Greeks. Within what degree a relationship marriage was permitted is uncertain. A man could marry his sister-in-law, as among the Israelites, and in one instance we hear of a marriage with a niece. In the time of Cambyses, a brother marries his half-sister by the same father, but this was probably an imitation of the Persian custom. The children, as we have seen, whether boys or girls, inherited alike, subject to the provisions of the parents' will. The will seems to have been of Babylonian origin. Testamentary devolution of the property went back to an early period of the country in which the legal relations of trade had been so fully developed. Trade implied private property and the idea of individual possession. The estate belonging to a person was his absolutely, to deal with pretty much as he would. He had the same right to alienate it as he had to increase it. In a commercial community, there could be no community of goods. As far back, therefore, as our materials carry us, the unit in Babylonian state is the individual, rather than the family. It is he with whom the law and the government deal, and the legal code of Babylonia is based upon the doctrine of individual responsibility. Private ownership is the keynote of Babylonian social life. The invention of the will, or documentary testament, followed naturally. The same legal powers that were required to protect a man's property during his lifetime were even more urgent when he was dead. The will was at first the title which gave the heir his father's estate. Gradually it developed, until it at last came to be an instrument by means by which the testator retained control over his property even after his death. As an example of the form which it usually assumed, we may take one which was drawn up in the 7th year of the reign of Cyrus as king of Babylon, 532 BC. It goes as following. Nebo-Baladan, the son of Samaspalesa, the son of the priest of the sun god, has, of his own free will, sealed all his estate, which he had inherited from Nebo-Belascu-Ikbi, the son of Nur-A, the son of the priest of the sun god, as the father was his mother, and from Kabta, the mother of Asat-Belit, his grandmother, consisting of a piece of land, a house, and the slaves or serfs attached to it, in accordance with the will, which his maternal grandmother, Nebo-Belascu-Ikbi, and his maternal grandmother, Kabta, had sealed and bequeathed to Nebo-Baladan, the son of their daughter, and has bequeathed them forever to Samaspalesa, the son of Samas-Ina-Esi-Eder, the son of the priest of the sun god. As long as Nebo-Baladan lives, the piece of ground, the house, the slaves, and all the rest of his property shall continue in his possession, according to the terms of this will. Whoever shall attempt to change them, may Anu, Bel, and A curse him. May Nebo, the divine scribe of Sagil, cut off his days. This will has been sealed in the presence of Sula, son of Bania, son of Epesh-Elu, son of Bel-Idin, son of Bel-Natsir, son of the priest of Gula, of Nebosum-Yukin, of Sula, son of Sigua, Nebo-Natsir, son of Ziria, son of Sumati, of Nebosum-Istir, son of Nebosum-Iskun, son of the wine merchant, and the scribe Samas-Zir-Usabsi, son of Zariku-Idin, son of the architect, at Babylon, the 19th day of Sabat, the 7th year of Cyrus, king of Babylon and the world. A remarkable instance of the application of the principles underlying testamentary devolution is to be found in the case of Ninip-Sum-Iskun, the son of a land surveyor, who handed over his property to his daughter Dabtu while he was still alive, stipulating only for the usufruct of it. Now, this text begins by saying that the testator claimed to his daughter, "Bring me writing materials, for I am ill. My brother has deserted me, my son has offended me. To you, therefore, I turn. Have pity on me, and while I live, support me with food, oil, and clothes. The income from my surveying business, in which I have 2/3 of a share, with my brother, do I hand over to you." After this preamble, the deed is drawn up in due form, attested, dated, and sealed. The whole of the testator's property is assigned to his daughter forever, the usufruct of his income only being reserved to himself as long as he shall live. He undertakes accordingly not to sell it, not to give to another, not to pawn it or alienate a portion of it, by the way of doubtly duly securing that the deed shall take effect, that the gods are invoked, as well as the law. Now, besides possessing the power of making a will, the head of a family was able to increase it by adoption. The practice of adoption was, of course, long-standing in Babylonia. The right to become king of Babylon, and so to claim legitimate rule over the civilized world, was conferred through adoption by the god Bel-Merodach. The claimant to sovereignty took the hand of Bel, as it was termed, and thereby became the adopted son of the god. Until this ceremony was performed, however much he might be a sovereign de facto, he was not so de jure. The legal title to rule could be given by Bel, and by Bel alone. As the pharaohs of Egypt were sons of Ra, the sun god, so it was necessary that the kings of Babylon should be the sons of the Babylonian sun god Merodach. Sonship alone made them legitimate. The prevalence of adoption in Babylonia had a much less recondite cause. It was one of the results of the recognition of private property and the principle of individual ownership. The head of the family naturally did not wish his estate to pass out of it and be transferred to a stranger. Whatever monogamy is the general rule, the feeling of family relationships is strong, and such was the case among the Babylonians. The feeling shows itself in the fact that when inherited land is sold, we find other members of the family signing their assent by the presence at the sale. The father or mother, accordingly, who adopted a child, did so with the intention of making him the heir, and so keeping the estate they had inherited, acquired in the hands of their own kin. The fact that women could adopt also points in the same direction. The woman was the equal of the man as regards the possession of property and the management of it, and like the man, therefore, she could determine who should inherit it. A slave could therefore be adopted, as well as a free man. It was one of the ways in which a slave obtained his freedom, and contracts for the sale of slaves generally guarantee that they have not been adopted into the family of a citizen. A curious suit was then brought before a special court at Babylon in the 10th year of Nabonidus, which illustrates the advantage that was sometimes taken of the fact. The action was brought against a slave who bears the Israelite name of Barekiel, and may therefore have been a Jew, and it was tried not only before the ordinary judges, but before special commissioners and elders as well. The following is a translation of the judgment which was delivered and preserved in the record office. Barekiel is the slave of Gaga, the daughter of, redeemable with money only. In the 35th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, he was given to Aki Nuri, son of Nebo-Nadin-Aki, as security for a debt of 28 shekels. Now he claims that he is the adopted son of Bel-Rimani, who has joined the hands of Shamash-Mudam-Mik, the son of Nebo-Nadin-Aki, and Kudasu, the daughter of Aki Nuri, in matrimony. This case was pleaded before the commissioners, the elders and judges of Nabonidus, king of Babylon, and the arguments were heard on both sides. They read the deeds relating to the servile condition of Barekiel, who from the 35th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, to the 7th year of Nabonidus, king of Babylon, had been sold for money, had been given as security for a debt, and had been handed over to Nubta, the daughter of Gaga, as her dowry. Nubta had afterwards by a sealed deed given him a house and other slaves to her son Zama-Idin and her husband Nidin-Abla. And they said to Barekiel, "You have bought an action and called yourself an adopted son. Prove to us your adoption." Barekiel thereupon confessed, "Twice did I run away from the house of my master, and for many days I was not seen. Then I was afraid and pretended to be an adopted son. My adoption is non-existent. I was the slave of Gaga, redeemable with money. Nubta, her daughter, made a gift of me, and by a sealed deed transferred me to her son Zama-Idin and her husband Nadin-Abla. After the death of Gaga and Nubta, I was sold by sealed contract to Iti Merodak Baladu, the son of Nebu-Akni-Idin, the son of Egibi. I will go and perform each of my duties." The elders, the commissioners, and the judges heard of this evidence, and restored him to his servile condition, and confirmed his possession by Shamash-Mudamik, the son of Nebu-Nadin-Aki, and Kudasu, the daughter of Aki Nuri, who had given him as a dowry to his daughter. Then follow the names of the judges and secretary, and the date of the place where the judgment was delivered, two of the judges further affixing their seals to the document, as well as a certain Kiribtu, who calls himself the shield-bearer, but who was probably one of the commissioners sent to investigate the case. After a slave had been adopted, it was in the power of the adoptive father to cancel the act of adoption and reduce him to his former state of servitude, if he had not performed his part of the contract, and the parties who had witnessed it were willing that it shall be cancelled. We learn from this deed that it was drawn up in the 13th year of Nabonidus. Here we read, Ikisi Abla, the son of Kuduru, the son of Nur-Sin, sealed a deed by which he adopted his servant Riman-Nibel, usually called Rimut, in return for his receiving of food and clothing from Riman-Nibel, but Riman-Nibel, usually called Rimut, has violated the contract ever since the deed by which he was adopted was sealed, and has given neither food, oil, nor clothing Whereas Esagil Ramat, the daughter of Ziria, the son of Naba, the wife of Nadin Merodach, the son of Ikisi-Abla, the son of Nur-Zin, has taken her father-in-law, has housed him, has been kind to him, and has provided him with food, oil, and clothing. Ikisi-Abla, the son of Kuduru, the son of Nur-Zin, has, therefore, of his own free will, cancelled the deed of adoption, and by a sealed deed has given Rimani Bel to wait upon Esagil Ramat and Nubta, the daughter of Esagil Ramat, and Nadin Merodach, the grandson of Nur-Sin. Esagil Ramat and Nubta, her daughter, shall he obey. After the death of Esagil Ramat, he shall wait on Nubta, her daughter. Whosoever shall change these words, and shall destroy this deed which Ikisi-Abla has drawn up and given to Esagil Ramat and Nubta, her daughter, may Merodach and the goddess Zalpanit denounce judgment upon him. Then come the names of 4 witnesses and the clerk, the date and the place of writing, and the statement of the deed that was indented in the presence of Bisa, the daughter of Ikisi-Abla. Now it is clear that the testator had little or no property of his own, and that he was too old or otherwise incapacitated to earn anything for himself. It's also clear that the adopted slave, who is described by the milder term galu or servant, had acquired some wealth, and that was his motive for his adoption. He, however, deserted and neglected his adopted father after his freedom had been secured to him, and thereby failed to carry out his part of the contract. Ikisi-Abla accordingly had the legal right to break it on his side. One of the effects of citizenship of the system, of adoption, was to give the privileges of Babylonian citizenship to a good many foreigners. The foreign origin of Barakiel, as evidenced by his name, was no obstacle to his claim to be a citizen, and the numerous contracts in which it is certified of a foreign slave that he has never been adopted prove the fact conclusively. A commercial community cannot afford to be exclusive on the ground of race and nationality. Such, then, was the family system in the Babylonia of the historical period. Polygamy was rare, and the married woman possessed full rights over her property, and could employ or bequeath it as she chose. The dowry she bought from her father, or other near relation, made her practically independent of her husband. Sons and daughters alike were able to inherit, and the possessor of property had the power of making a will. The law seems to have placed but few restrictions upon the way in which he could bestow his wealth. A family could be increased or prevented from dying out by means of adoption, and new blood could thus be introduced into it. The rights and duties of individuals were fully recognized. It was with him alone that the law had to deal. Nevertheless, a few traces survived of that doctrine of solidarity of the family, which had preceded the development of individual ownership and freedom of action. The bride was given in marriage by her parents, or, failing these, by her nearest male relations, and where an estate was sold which had been long in possession of a certain family, it was customary for the rest of the family to signify their consent by attending the sale. We may gather, however, that the sale was not invalidated if the consent was not obtained. In the older days of Babylonian history, moreover, it was usual for the property of a deceased citizen to be divided among his heirs without the intervention of a will. It went in the first instance to his widow, and was then divided equally among his children, whether body heirs or adopted ones. the oldest son alone receiving an additional share in return for administering the estate. But disputes frequently arose over the division, and the members of the family went to law with one another. In such cases it became the customary to place the whole of the property in the hands of the priests of the city temple, who thus corresponded to the English Court of Chancery, and made the division as they judged best. These results, however, were not always satisfactory, and it was doubtless in order to avoid both the litigation and necessity of appointing executors who were not members of the family that the will came to play such an important role in the succession to property. In bequeathing his possessions to the head of the family, he was expected to observe the usual rule of division, but it ceased to be obligatory to do so. And next time we will continue with Chapter 3, Education and Death. But, for now, I must take leave, and we're going to meet back here next time. I promise, we're going to have lots of fun. So, let me thank my top-tier patrons and supporters first. Dark, Kerry, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Aaron, James, Jeffrey. Where am I? Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine again, Fizarbo, Legitmus, Maverick, Susan, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Cameron, Alexander, Nicholas, Daniel, and JR. Thank you very much. Okay, that's it for me for today. Lots of love to you all. See you next time.